Okay, I'm going to have to do this another way. As you can see, my frames per second will lock at 30 whenever I'm recording fraps. And there's no way I've not been able to get fraps to actually go above, even if I tell it to do 60 frames per second. So I'm going to explain as best as I can. What I've done here is I've taken the forest biome. That's what this is. It's forest biome in the game. This is the full gen map here. I took out all the decorations except for the building decorations, that random gen, and any decoration that they put in here upon themselves, like the trash and stuff like that. But as far as grass, rocks, resources, trees, they're all gone. This is to debunk everybody saying it's trees, it's forages, it's everything, because it's not. It's got nothing to do with that. I'm going to explain to you when the frames per second drops. And the fun pimps, what you need to do is basically do this and research from this point on. Okay, what we have here is, when I come into the city, you're going to notice when you do this here and you come to a little town, you're going to get 30 frames per second. Depending where you're standing, where your camera is looking, is when the frames per second jump, and you're going to notice this. For example, if I'm not recording and I'm standing about right here looking at this, and about right here, and I'm going to pause this and double check, so I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Right now my screen's showing 30 frames, and it's not going to go over because of fraps, but right here I'm shooting about 47 frames per second looking at this group of buildings at this camera angle. Alright, basically if I move further out, I keep the frames per second until I hit a certain point. If I keep the camera straight moving, at a certain point it will drop down to 29 frames per second. Another thing I've noticed, that if you move your camera up to a certain degree above, like for example around here, move it up slowly when you're in the area. These buildings, as you can see, are still in my screen view, but whenever I'm capped down at 30, if I just move the camera up just a little bit to about somewhere around in there, I start getting 50-60 frames per second. That's with all the buildings showing. The buildings are still there, and I pop up 50-60 frames per second. But if I move the camera down, I cap at 30 frames per second. 29, 30. It don't pop in again until you move your camera down about like this right here. Then you'll pop back up your frames per second. So it technically cannot be the objects in the background causing this, because the objects are still in my view. And just by doing this right here, moving my camera up while the objects are still in view, I'll pop up to 50, 55, 60 frames per second. This happens no matter where I look at. No matter if I was to sit back and go this far back and look, I'll be doing 30 frames per second. But the minute I pull my camera up, like this right here, and about in that angle right there, even though the buildings are still in my view, I pop up to 60, 50, 60 frames per second. So somewhere with this camera and the load system, this is happening. I'm not sure which actually is causing it, but this is what's happening. As you can see, the world around me, this chunk is not producing any rocks, any trees, any trash, anything. Another thing that I had noticed, that has to do with the camera view. There's a gas station down here, and I'll show you what I was doing down here and what reproduced this, and where I started discovering. If you'll notice these little hills here, when I go up, if I'm looking like this and I go up, frames per second will jump. But what I was doing is I was standing here in this area right here, and it caught my eye. I was sitting right here looking at angle, and I had 47 frames per second. But when I would, and I was not flying or anything, I was sitting here and I had like 40 some frames, 47, 50 frames per second. And then all of a sudden I would click fly, and as soon as I moved up, I dropped and capped at 30 frames per second. just by elevating myself without even moving my camera. So I decided to test this, and I went over here, and it's not the build, it's got something to do with the camera angle that's causing this. But I was sitting here and I had 50, 51, 52 frames per second and up to 60 frames, and I was sitting here like this and I had that many frames. But then I walked up here on this trash and I dropped down to 30 frames per second. I moved back and I went back up. Every time I'd walk on the trash and change my elevation, I would drop in frames per second. Now every time you're sitting here and you're looking in this game right here and you lose frames per second, as you can see, I'm doing 20 frames per second. Here's a perfect example. All these builds, you can see, hopefully y'all can see that frames per second in game on the video, showing 20 frames. But watch this as I move it up. As I move the camera up, it'll cap back up to 30. There it goes, popping up. Now I can't show you where it's hitting 60 frames and all, because Fraps is locking me in at 30 frames for some reason. But as you can see, it's up there at 30 frames. So right now it should roughly be about 60 some frames. The buildings are still in view, but the minute I pull the camera down, you notice it starts to cap down. And as you can see with Fraps, it's capping down exactly at 20. But when I'm at 60 frames, it caps down exactly at 30. So I'm not sure exactly, but this is where the problem lies with the lag. The frame per second drop, this is where it's all happening. But as you can see, we're sitting down here at 20. But if I move the camera up, as I get higher in the elevation, as you can see, I'm moving up. The frames per second are jumping. 29, 30, there we go. And I'm sitting at this, but these builds are still in my view. So either it's got something to do with the load system and how the camera's facing it. I don't know much about the load system. I'm learning myself, but it's got something to do with either the load system, looking at the object, or the way the camera's facing. But these objects are still in my view, scene view, and I'll get 30 frames looking up with them still in the view. They're still in my screen, but when I look down, they drop and they cap. And this is what's happening throughout the game. It don't matter where you're at. It's got nothing to do with the buildings. It's got nothing to do with the objects. Yeah, of course, you're going to get low frame rates whenever you got tons of trees, tons of objects and all, but not where it's capping down, where it's pulling itself completely down like it's doing. And I've been through a forest with all the trees going before, and I've been sitting down and I'll be going at 60, 65 frames per second, then all of a sudden, boom, bottleneck down to 30, 29, 15, and then if I move my camera around, it wasn't until recently that when I decided just to try to figure out maybe it was an object that was causing it. Maybe there's a specific object causing the frames per second drop. So I decided just to kill off all the decorations and test it out. And I was hitting up high frames until I hit this town. And then I started looking around the town, and that's when I discovered the elevation of the camera. Actually, as you can see, here we go. Goes up 30 frames. And it's clocking up there. And I got all these buildings in. As long as I don't move the camera, I'm going to stay at 30 frames and clocking up there. But the minute I move my camera downward, as you can see, the frames per second are dropping down to 20. And I wish Fraps didn't do this, because I could really show you. But if you want to test this out, kill the forest biome, kill everything that spawns in it, find a small town, just like I did right here. Go up in here, look at the buildings, move your camera up to a certain degree, watch the frames per second go way up there, pull your camera down, and watch them bottleneck. This is what's happening to a lot of us. And this is exactly what's causing it. It's got nothing to really do with the objects. It's got something to do with the camera angle. Something in there. So if you can look into that, hopefully y'all can get this fixed. But this is what I've discovered, and now you can just rest assured that it ain't the forges, it's not trees, it's not any of this other stuff, because I've had 60 frames in the forest with trees, and I've not had this. It's just pinpoints of the camera. When we're running and we're looking, it's the camera. It's got something to do with the camera, maybe the camera and the load system, I'm not sure, but there you go.